Hello,
Hi, Delvon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your slides and all that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I was testing it.
All right, we'll give it one more minute because it looks like people are still flowing in. Then we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us today. Before we get started, I want to remind our students that we are accepting applications for our Harvard Award. So if you are interested in applying for that, you can contact me. You can go to our website for the link, but let me know if you have any questions. I think that's it for today. So Delvon, if you're ready, we'll pass it on to you.
All right, thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Okay. Hi everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Delvon. I'm now a fourth year PhD candidate in the department, and today I'm very excited to be presenting this work. So the paper is entitled "Change in the Stress About Police Brutality and Substance Use Among Young People from 2017 to 2020." So I wanted to dedicate a slide to kind of going over the story behind this paper. So I'm not that active on Twitter, but I use it to see what other academics are doing and to kind of get a general sense of what certain institutions are up to and what journals are publishing outside of the email notifications. However, after sharing the paper that me, Bree, Nancy, and David Colston published on discrimination and polysubstance use, I think a couple of years ago, Adam Leventhal at USC liked it and reached out about potentially collaborating on a similar research project focused on disparities in substance use, and that led us to scheduling a Zoom meeting, chatting, and I learned more about one of his studies outside of USC HEAL, or the Health, Emotion, and Addiction Laboratory, called the Health and Happiness Study, or the Happiness and Health Study, sorry. We were both interested in exploring some of the police brutality related measures in that data set, and that led us here. And I figured I'd share how I'm working with that data that I'll be presenting soon. So it's a presentation overview. I'll spend some time providing background knowledge on police brutality as an exposure in the US and how it affects health, including how it might affect substance use, with the caveat that this background is in no way extensive. I will then dive into our study, including the aims, methods, and results, and then hopefully leave plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So for the background, police brutality is one of the oldest forms of structural racism in the US. It historically affected Black Americans dating back to the era of slavery, when police captured and punished runaway slaves. These were called slave patrols. Back then, tactics included the use of excessive force to control and produce desired slave behavior. So direct and indirect police brutality is a pervasive exposure in the US, and one that is salient to communities of color. In our paper, we define police brutality as unwarranted or illegal acts of physical, psychological, and sexual violence by law enforcement on citizens. So there's a growing awareness and concern about police brutality among the general population. Many will not experience police brutality directly, but many will experience police contact or encounters. And each incident likely takes an emotional toll on individuals and communities, especially among racial ethnic minorities. There's vicarious or indirect exposure, and that's very important to public health as it can have a ripple effect. For example, one instance of police brutality that doesn't directly affect somebody may adversely affect multiple people who are close to that person or who are in that community, and therefore have a population health level impact. And there are also racial ethnic differences in how police affects the stress and mental health, which we'll touch on soon. So for example, a study by Graham et al. Showed the percent worry about experiencing police brutality by race ethnicity among youth. And with the youth had options of worrying a lot, a little, or not at all. And for example, they found that these are adult, not youth, white adults do not worry at all, nearly twice as much as Hispanic and Black adults. So while empirical evidence is limited, media outlets have highlighted surges in youth and young adults' awareness of police brutality. So many youth or young adults have taken on leadership roles for protest and advocacy. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the high-profile murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, for example, in May of 2020, have sparked public awareness and civil unrest related to police brutality. While we highlight what happened in 2020, I want to also acknowledge that the media outlets did not start covering events in 2020. In fact, they were also extensively covering the killings of Black folks, such as like Eric Gardner and Michael Brown, Tamir Rice back in 2014, which also incited protest and widespread concern. But the most recent case in which there was national attention toward police brutality and a call for police accountability was in 2020, especially incited by the national coverage of George Floyd. So police contact or encounters and brutality detrimentally impact mental health. Studies have linked police brutality with mental health problems among youth and young adults. For example, police brutality is associated with psychological distress, symptoms of anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and suicide attempts and ideation. Studies have also cited racial ethnic differences and distress associated with police contacts or encounters. So this is a figure that displays the change in poor mental health days associated with exposure to police killings by race of police killing victim and whether the victim was armed. And the authors here use data from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. And so these on the graph or figure here, there are regression coefficients and confidence intervals, and they show the change in poor mental health. And then again, by killing exposure type. And as we see at the very top, there's an association between Black adults or for Black adults after indirect exposure of killing or police killing of unarmed Black Americans. However, there are no other statistically significant associations. This figure is from another study, and it shows the percentage of youth reporting forms of emotional distress during witness police stops by race ethnicity. It might be a little difficult to differentiate the patterns on my screen, but the race ethnicities are ordered accordingly from left to right on the column bars, on the y-axis corresponding to up and down on the legend. So from white, Latinx, Black, multiracial, and other. And as we can see, the racial ethnic groups were similar in terms of feeling scared, but when it came to feeling angry or unsafe, percentages were elevated for racial ethnic minorities relative to white youth. And to a degree, even those who were classified as other had elevated percentages. So police brutality via use of force is additionally associated with morbidity and mortality in 5 ways. These include fatal injuries, adverse physiological response, racist public reactions resulting in stress, arrest, incarcerations, and legal, medical, and funeral bills, and integrated oppressive structures. And all of these also result in additional financial stress and systemic disempowerment. For example, this figure from another study shows inequity in lifetime risk of being killed by the police use of force by sex and race ethnicity from 2013 to 2018. So the dashes in this figure are the confidence intervals, and the males are on the left and the females are on the right, and it's by race ethnicity. The data come from the National Vital Statistics Systems. And here the mortality rate ratios are clearly higher for the African-American males compared to white males. This figure here is kind of a sidebar, but it's from a study out of the Lancet last year, and it shows the percent of police brutality-related deaths that are misclassified by the National Vital Statistics Systems as not related to police brutality in the US from the early 80s to 2018. So the higher percentage, the more misclassification. And these graphs or these maps are broken down by race ethnicity. Whites up on the top left, Blacks at the bottom left, and on the top right's other races, and on the bottom right is Hispanic any race. So this really just demonstrates that there are biases in the reporting of police-related deaths in our data, and that some of the racial ethnic differences that we do observe in empirical research may be understated. And public health leaders have called for more equitable surveillance and monitoring, but this progress has really been limited. So incidents of vicarious exposure to police brutality are race-based stressors or trauma. And this is defined as fear of victimization and increased awareness of inequitable treatment. And among youth, these are also described as racialized adverse childhood experiences. And these can have a negative effect on psychological stress, and exposures can also lead to negative health behaviors such as substance use and misuse. However, the literature on whether police brutality is associated with substance use is limited. I would say limited outside of the literature on policing due to substance use. I'm more so referring to whether policing leads to substance use or additional use. But however, the stress coping literature suggests that certain populations may use substances to cope with such stressors. And these relationships may have important downstream consequences, such as substance use disorders and physical health outcomes. And the idea that policing itself and brutality differentially patterned by race, ethnicity, racial ethnic disparities, and substance use may be driven by police brutality exposures. So a key consideration is that exposure to police brutality in general comes in many forms. Mainly direct and indirect police brutality was discussed, but I'm not presenting any data related to police brutality directly, which I'll touch on soon. So for example, we have police brutality in general. We have direct police encounters, or which can be, for example, during traffic stops or getting arrested. And then vicarious exposure, which could be seeing police brutality on the news or on social media or in person, or being concerned, stressed, or worried about police brutality. And there's also policy and enforcement. So in this study, we use measures of concern, stress, or worry about police brutality or a form of vicarious exposure, and that these worries may stem from previous indirect exposure, for example, or worries that it may happen in the future. And I will dive right into the methods here soon. So I hope you can see this, but lastly, before moving to our study, I wanted to show a recent conceptual model published in Social Science and Medicine about the effects of policing on population health. So this model explores both the direct and vicarious effects of negative police encounters on health, on the individual, community, and systems, both in the short and the long term. So obviously, and they also show contextual factors on these relationships as well. But obviously, I did not have the time to talk about all of these pathways, but really just wanted to display that this model shows that scholars have been thinking about the vast range of health effects that police community encounters can produce. And this is helpful to inform policy at all levels and hopefully some type of reform. So to our study. Again, it's entitled Change in Distress About Police Brutality and Substance Use Among Young People. I'm going to go over the aims, the methods, and results. We aim to examine changes in distress about police brutality from early 2017 to mid-2020, or directly after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, when distress may have heightened within a cohort of young people living in Southern California. And we also aim to assess the extent to which changes in police brutality distress were associated with nicotine, cannabis, alcohol, and other drug use overall and stratified by race, ethnicity. So the data come from the Happiness and Health Project. This was a study out of USC that started in 2013 and sampled 3,396 teenagers across 10 high schools. Surveys were administered semi-annually, and data collection is still ongoing. The measures broadly include substance use, mental health, health behaviors, and sociodemographics. They call it Happiness and Health, or H&H 2.0, or Wave 9, and that's when young adulthood was starting to be included. And this includes youth aged up into young adulthood and it was first administered between 2018 and 2019. And waves 10 and 11 are also available right now. So we use data from waves 8, or collected between January 2017 and June 2017, and 10, or data were collected between May 2020 and October 2020. We excluded wave 9 because they did not capture any measures related to police brutality, but these measures were captured in waves 8 and 10. And the surveys were administered in classrooms from 2013 to 2018 until they were administered online starting in 2019. So for the participants, at wave 8, there were 3,140 respondents who completed the survey. And that's a total of 256 missing since wave 1. However, at wave 10, 22.4% of the respondents were missing due to attrition, resulting in 2,436 participants eligible for the analysis, with the note that a lot of attrition does come from the young adult surveys. And then out of the 2,400 participants, only 1,796 had complete data on measures used in this analysis. And as you can probably notice, there's a lot of missing, which we will discuss later. And then for the measures, we had distress about police brutality, substance use, and covariates. I'm going to touch on each of these separately. So at waves 8 and 10, respondents separately rated whether they were concerned, worried, or stressed about police brutality or unfair treatment of members in your community by law enforcement. Response items included 0, not at all, 1, slightly, 2, somewhat, 3, very, and 4, extremely. And we defined distress to be the composite of concern, worry, and stress. And we created a composite mean ranging from 0 to 4 of the 3 ratings. And then change in distress was calculated by subtracting distress at baseline or wave 8 from follow-up or wave 10, and this ranged from -4 to 4. And then substance use at wave 10, or 5 outcomes, were defined as the past 30-day use, yes or no, of nicotine, which included cigarettes, ENDS, or electronic nicotine delivery systems, IQOS, or other heated tobacco devices, smokeless types of cigars. Then we had cannabis, which included different modalities, or smoking, blunting, consuming, vaping, or using synthetic cannabis. Alcohol was defined as having at least 1 drink in the past 30 days. And then other drugs was defined as misuse of prescription painkillers, stimulant pills, or sedatives, or the use of heroin. We also included a number of substances used as a count variable, and that ranged from 0 to 19. The covariates we included at wave 10 included sociodemographic characteristics, or age, sex, race, ethnicity, education, and personal financial status. Missing data on these sociodemographics were imputed based on data from previous waves. I'm sorry, to clarify, missing data on age, sex, and race, ethnicity. And then we also included a concern, stress, or worry variable about COVID-19, which was defined the same way as the police brutality variable. So for the statistical analysis, we fit 4 adjusted logistic regression models to estimate odds ratios for associations between distress and each binary outcome. Again, the exposure variable is calculated subtracting distress from wave 8 to 10, and the outcome variables are measured only at wave 10. And then we also fit 1 adjusted negative binomial regression for the count variable to estimate risk ratios for associations between change in distress and the number of substances used. We ran each model with a 2-way interaction term between distress and race, ethnicity, and then additionally assessed effect modification by stratifying each model by race, ethnicity. We also conducted some sensitivity analyses. We added the COVID-19 variable as a covariate to the model to see its effect. We plan to examine the frequency of use in the past 30 days of each broad substance use category, and that's not yet completed. And we also plan to explore some additional interactions, and those are not yet completed as well. But I do have results based on the main analyses. So we'll dive right into those. So this is a table of participant characteristics at wave 10. So this is just showing distributions. I think this is very important to go over, especially since the cohort is so racially diverse. The mean age is 21 years old at wave 10. The majority of the respondents were female, 60%, and more than half were Hispanic or Latinx at 54%, followed by about 1 in 5 that were Asian American Pacific Islander, and 1 in 10 were white. We had a very small sample of Black or African Americans at 3%. To further go down the table, about 3/4 had a post-secondary or were working toward a post-secondary education, and most lived comfortably or met the needs with the little left in the sample. And then here's continuing the previous table to show the exposure and outcome variables. So the mean change in the stress about police brutality from waves 8 to 10 was 0.84, indicating that on average, distress has increased over 3 years. And then furthermore, about 1/5 of the sample used nicotine in the past 30 days, 35% used cannabis, over half used alcohol, and 2% used other drugs. And the mean number of substances used was about 2. So this is a figure showing the change in mean distress by race ethnicity. The lowest mean distress was among white respondents and respondents classified as other in 2017, and the highest was among Hispanic or Latinx and Black respondents. And we see that over a 3-year period, all groups had an increase in distress, with the largest increase being among white respondents. Note that we didn't include confidence intervals in the figure for interpretability, mainly because they were just overlapping, but all changes from wave 8 to 10 were statistically significant, except among Black respondents who had the lowest net increase. And that's probably due to a power issue, but they had consistently the highest distress of police brutality between the 2 waves. So this table here shows the regression results for overall models, the non-stratified models. And the bolded effect estimates represent statistical significance. So as we can see, we'll start with cannabis use. Each greater 1 unit change in the stress from baseline to follow-up was associated with 11% higher odds of cannabis use in the full sample, and also 13% higher odds of alcohol use and 8% higher risk of using an additional substance in the overall sample. Associations involving nicotine and other drug use were not statistically significant. So I present the regression results stratified by race ethnicity by substance. Here I'm showing 2 of them, nicotine and cannabis. I believe it would have been too cluttered to show them all. But as we can see, there are really no statistically significant associations except cannabis use, which is at the bottom left, among Black or African American respondents. And however, some associations were trending in the positive direction, particularly among the respondents we classified as other for both nicotine and cannabis use. So now we have stratified results for alcohol and other drug use. And I'd like to note that the cells with dashes in them are suppressed due to model convergence issues. And we see that associations were present only for Hispanic or Latinx respondents for alcohol use. Specifically, Hispanic or Latinx respondents had 13% increased odds for each greater unit change in distress. And then lastly, we have stratified results for the number of substances used. And again, these results are based on negative binomial regression models. And we see that for the number of substances used in the past 30 days, the stratified model suggests that with each greater unit change in distress, the risk of using an additional substance increased by 35% among Blacks, 6% among Hispanic, 13% among multiracial respondents, and 30% among respondents reclassified as other. So that's it for the results. Now we'll dive into a brief discussion of those results and save, I think we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So lots of text here, but the key findings, the stress about police brutality increased from 2017 to 2020 among all racial ethnic groups. While the largest net increase was among white respondents, the stress remained highest among Black and Hispanic respondents. And change in the stress about police brutality was associated with substance use, particularly cannabis and alcohol use. And we found variations by race ethnicity. As expected, we found associations among Black and Hispanic respondents, also multiracial respondents, and respondents we classified as other, and did not observe associations among white respondents. So race-based stressors lead to adverse behavioral outcomes. A lot of the previous literature have explored police-related exposures on mental health, and this study adds to that, showing that there's a relationship between, or it suggests there's a relationship between police distress and substance use, and that's likely a function of race-based stress and coping. So stress coping via substances can also lead to heavier use and dependence, especially if the stress is prevalent. And the criminality associated with all substances can lead to more police contact or encounters. So there's kind of a cycle that could occur here. And for example, war on drug dynamics are still present today via racial biases and disproportionate surveillance and targeting of minority communities. Back in the 70s, the war on drugs encouraged the police to prioritize and target drug users, irrespective of non-drug crime happening in communities. Another example is illicit drug use and arrest. People are more likely to be arrested if they're using illicit drugs. And another example is that access to substance misuse treatment might occur through law enforcement. So police contact is very prevalent among substance use communities as well. Again, police brutality is a result of structural racism, and structural racism is a driver of population-based racial ethnic health disparities. The police as an institution has systematically targeted minority populations dating back to slavery. And in my opinion, police reform is the best intervention at the population level to reduce disparities in health and substance use in this case. However, reducing the incidence of police brutality, that will reduce stress responses to police contact and encounters, but I acknowledge that this is probably not the most feasible place to start. So there have been other options proposed by scholars, such as allowing for introspection, for example, among police officers via increased awareness and additional training. One that I like is stricter and more concrete consequences for example, racial profiling and brutality, and at the end of the day, absolute accountability. I thought it was appropriate to talk about limitations because there's quite a few. The first one that people have probably already noticed is attrition and missingness. So again, the youth in this study were enrolled in fall 2013, and they were in 9th grade. The first point of our study, or this paper, was spring of 2017, or wave 8. And there's attrition up until that point, but it's not as prominent. Most of the attrition comes from the young adult surveys, which was about 22%. But the point is, there's people who have never made it into the study, the present study, people who did at baseline or wave 8 and then were lost to follow up. That's the biggest proportion. And then we had people who completed both waves 8 and 10, but did not make it into the analytic sample. So there's a very profound amount of missingness there. And that obviously, comes with potential biases, especially if attrition is selective. And we're in the process of doing some sensitivity analyses, such as checking differences in baseline characteristics between waves 8 and 10, but we're also talking more about that. Next is limited causal inference. Casual inference. While the study is longitudinal, it's still observational. Plus, most of the measures in this study were used at wave 10. We also have lack of statistical power. lack of representation, especially among the Black or African American group, which was at 3%. And while this sample is highly diverse, it represents a large proportion of Latinx and Asian communities in Southern California, but not so much the Black community, which can come with the generalizability concerns, which is at the bottom here that I'll touch on in a bit. So going back to one of the key takeaways in the previous slide, we talked about how the stress increased for all racial ethnic groups. But we operationalized the stress using 3 constructs, and that was concern, stress, and worry about police brutality. We may be missing some information on which domain the stress is increasing in, for example. It may be increasing via concern for certain groups than it is for worry, and that's something that we might want to explore more. Another limitation is that substance use was not biochemically confirmed, and there are response biases. These are younger populations taking these surveys. And building back on the diverse sample, there are some generalizability concerns, mainly that this study probably can't be generalized to the general US population of young people. And also in terms of cannabis use, that's legal in California. So these associations may look differently in places where it's not. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the co-authors on this paper. So Lauren Howard is a grad student at USC who completed all of the analyses for us. So thank you, Lauren. Evan Kruger at the time was a postdoc at USC, but now faculty at Tulane University. We all know Nancy here at CSEF, an associate professor and my advisor and dissertation chair. Chanina Hughes-Halbert is faculty at USC, and so is Adam Leventhal, who is faculty in the PI on the H&H study. Also, for those of you that are interested, the paper is currently under review in drug and alcohol dependence, and we're currently working on a revise and resubmit where a good chunk of these sensitivity analyses are being applied to. So fingers crossed that the editors like our revisions and that the paper is accepted. All right, and that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? Thank you for the applause.
Hi, Delvon. Great job. That was super interesting. One thing that stuck out to me that I feel like always pops up in policing research is the unexpected effect size among white respondents, right? Like it's unexpected, but yet it keeps kind of turning up in different ways. Can you remind me, the questions, were they specific to stress and worry about one's own interactions with the police, or just kind of like the general nature of what's happening with policing? Do you remember the wording?
Yeah, so it's about treatment of members in your community.
Okay. I'm just trying to think of, I'm wondering, I don't know. I guess first, maybe I'll ask you as the author, what do you think's going on there?
I think the wording is very important. I do agree that I have seen that in the literature that there is a larger representation of whites too in the data sets, but when it comes to police-related measures about your own safety, I think sometimes these associations look a little differently compared to what I have found in this study. But also, I think that the social environment and what was going on during the time at data collection for this study is also important. We kind of hypothesized, I didn't include hypotheses in the study, but we did hypothesize that the stress would go up among all groups. We were surprised that it increased so much among the white group. It increased more than twofold, right? But we also think that, it's interesting that this is a younger cohort of respondents in California. And I do think with all the national coverage of like Black Lives Matter and police brutality and all that stuff, I can't see how that that could have occurred. But what we did find was expected to us, that while the stress increased for all groups, it remained the highest among the groups who were disproportionately affected by policing.
Yes, right. All the relative ordering still
Mm-hmm.
was expected, right? Yeah, I kind of had the same thought, like maybe there was the most room for increase of awareness among whites. And that was just reflected, but like lack of personal experience, but learning about it through the media over that time period. So that's what I was thinking too, but super interesting. And I think it's an important line of research to be tying it into substance use. So thanks for sharing today.
Yeah, of course. And I think place has something to do with it too. California is a little more liberal than other states in the US, right? And it would be very interesting to see this applied to other places in the US, like the South, for example, the geographic South, and among other age groups as well. I think this age group represents Gen Z, and they're known to be a little more open. That's opinionated, but that's what they're known for. So perhaps it's a very interesting, but we are limited by examining these associations in Southern California.
Yeah, very good point. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Delvon.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Very, very great presentation, by the way. So one question I have is just maybe something to think about for future research, is to maybe determine associations between maybe reform with respect to countering substance use, because as you indicated, the war on drugs approach precipitates police brutality, which as was indicated had a significant associations with distress that ironically results in higher substance use. So which ideas potentially you have for future that involve maybe counteracting substance use that does not involve police brutality?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And I do think that in terms of future research, we only utilize 2 waves. It would definitely be interesting to use more information. I know wave 11 is completed now. At the time of conducting this study, it wasn't, but it would be interesting to see how things may evolve over time, especially among those who use substances. So I do think that's a good point and a good avenue for future research. In terms of your other point, yeah, these associations, we kind of expected to see differences by substances that are, I guess, considered illicit versus licit. But at the same time, we were employing the stress coping model. And I can't speak for everybody, but I think that whether the substance is licit or illicit may not matter as much in terms of using it to cope with stress. And this is also a younger cohort. So we didn't see any associations with the other drug use, which included the illicit substances, but that use group was also very small. It's about 2% of the sample. So it's kind of hard to tell if there would be differences with this study. I hope that answered your question.
It did.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could speak to one of the comments you made at the beginning of your talk was about the underestimation of just the scope of police involved violence and deaths in the, as a result of law enforcement. And I wonder if I know it's not directly what you were presenting on today, but I wonder to what degree those conversations have progressed, or sort of what type of because it's a challenge. When I'm thinking about, like, for example, like the National Violent Death Reporting System, we have there's some data there that might be able to speak to that, but most of it won't be there. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is it strikes me that solving that problem, like hopefully would help like make it clear, you know, the magnitude of what we're talking about and the disproportionate impact on communities, and but also like it requires buy-in from lots of different types of stakeholders that don't necessarily have a history of working together. It doesn't mean that they're adversarial, but they just haven't necessarily worked together on such a problem. And so I wonder if either of you know sort of what progress or conversations are happening there, or if if you had additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. So the slide that I presented was on it was based on a paper published last year, and it showed the percent of police brutality related deaths. So that were misclassified by the National Violence Statistics System as not related to police brutality. And I also mentioned that may demonstrate that there are biases in some of our data that we're using to examine these associations. I think that that's mainly related to police-related deaths, as far as I know, and that's because they're not, you know, on death certificates, they're not writing that someone's death was attributed to a police officer. And we saw in that one graph that varies by race, ethnicity. I think in some places it was even, I can actually reshare it. In some places it was even higher than others. But among whites, we see that the percentages are actually higher in some areas too. The percent, it's down here from 0 to 100. We see that the blue represents lower percentages and the orange or red represent higher percentages. So also among whites, that there's a high percentage in certain areas that are being misclassified. So it's a very interesting point. And to kind of comment on your other related points, and that may induce bias in our data. And it's hard to really, we can advocate, I think, as scientists for things to change or for certain policies. But the data that we are using and publishing papers with or presenting research on, if they are biased, then some of these differences may be understated. And I think that can go a long way, especially when we're presenting these results to people, stakeholders, or policymakers who are in charge of making things change. So as far as I know, there have been a few researchers I've read related to this topic who have like religiously called for less bias in reporting and to pay more attention to our data sets. And as far as I know, that's pretty much it, to my knowledge. But it's something that I really wanted to bring up while giving this presentation, because it is interesting, especially if you look at, for example, the top right, people who are classified as other races. Not too sure what's going on there, but for white, Black, and Hispanic, there are certain places where misclassification is very high.
Yeah, and I think it also, illustrates, not that this is a necessary part of your argument, but that like everyone benefits from less police brutality. Like the whole world is better off in a world where fewer people are shot by police, and that there are some groups that are going to, this is an equity issue, but in general, this is a better world that we all would prefer to live in. And so I feel like, having, and yeah, definitely sort of I think even that kind of showing the state comparisons is helpful to other states. When I've done work on, talked to people here on suicide deaths in Michigan using the violent death reporting system, they're very interested in knowing how other states do things, how they, what, you know, whether they write, you know, for example, like these, there's parts of the data that they're responsible for writing themselves. And so they're like, well, is that, do we write more than other states? Do we write less? What do their narratives look like, et cetera? Like, I mean, just the point is like, there could be cross learning from places that have less misclassification to places that have more. And then, you know, you sort of really try to encourage more both uniformity across, but also learning from each other.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And yeah, I think that like the biggest takeaway for me is that the inaccurate reporting or the misclassification, it just really again obscures the larger issue, which is the structural racism that includes law enforcement. But again, we did look at the charts, and there's a lot of misclassification among the white group as well. So I think it really just requires further investigation too. But at the end of the day, we want our data to be as objective as possible. So we're really calling for the government to, because that is the NBSS, for the government to more accurately report that data. I think we have time for more questions.
Any other questions? All right, well, with that, I want to please join me in thanking Delvon for his fantastic presentation this afternoon. And I know I missed our announcements beforehand, but I'm sure Abby told you about our upcoming events or planning events. Well, anyway, or if not, we are anticipating having several celebrations this spring to be able to just recognize our graduates, and then also, you know, be able to just come together and now that COVID's on its way, at least currently, sure for the time being, foreseeable future. So again, I hope everyone has a safe and relaxing and restful, restorative spring break, and we'll see you back here in March. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.